Thank you. Well, good morning. This is going to be, in part, a story about cotton. In the period before the 1790s, the only cotton that was really grown was on the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, and it was long staple cotton, highly prized, and it continued to be so. But as you remember, when the cotton gin was invented in the 1790s by Eli Whitney, it created a revolution. Upland short staple cotton could be grown anywhere almost, and almost any kind of soil. And so it began to spread all over the southern states. The wonderful thing about it was that through the 1820s and the 1830s, the demand for cotton increased because of industrialization in Britain, in other European countries, and in the North. So cotton, short staple cotton, spread everywhere, and it gave an enormous boost to slavery. That slaves who were perhaps redundant on old, worn out Virginia tobacco lands were now highly desirable to work in plantations in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. And so could I see the next, yeah, thanks. But it was discovered, well, before I finish that, I wanted to say that no matter how much the demand, it was always possible to increase the amount of cotton grown, and the cotton exports of the United States, growing steadily all through the first half of the 19th century, kept meeting rising demand and rising prices. And that really created the Old South and King cotton. But the demand for long staple cotton was also very real because it was a much better fiber, prized for making higher grade cloth. It had been limited very much to the low country, but Alachua County soil and climate also suited it. So beginning in the 1850s, we had a migration of planters and their enslaved labor from the immediate vicinity of Camden, South Carolina, in the two adjacent counties. And the first one, I believe, to come down and try Alachua was Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale bought land in 1854, and by 1856 was operating the Hale plantation that we all know, and that Karen Kirkman, who's going to be speaking later in this series, has had so much to do in making a wonderful museum. The cotton planters in Alachua County in the 1850s were almost all members of one extended family. They were cousins and brothers-in-law and relatives of one kind or another mostly related in some way to the chestnut family. And as we know, the chestnut family, who are very prominent in Alachua County in current years, in the 1870 census are identified as mulattoes, that is, having a white parent. So perhaps they were also part of this extended cousinage and other enslaved people too. Next. One of these people was Robert Rogerson Williams. I'm sorry, David Rogerson Williams. He came from Darlington County in South Carolina, bringing his servants with him. He was the grandson of a South Carolina governor of the name of David Rogerson Williams. So he was not junior, but the second. And he bought 1,000 acres on Williston Road, just not very far from where Oakhammock is today. I'm not sure whether any of the Oakhammock property is included in it. And he began Serenola Plantation. The plantation was uncleared land in 1857, so he had to develop everything from scratch. But he bought this from the Federal Land Agency at $2 an acre and called it Serenola. And it's obvious why he called his plantation Serenola, because his mother was Serena Chestnut Williams. His sister was Serena Williams, and his daughter was Serena Williams. So he included all of his family in the story. Next, there's a marker now at Squirrel Ridge Park. I'm sure you know where that is. That tells the story of Serenola. It's not that marker, it's another one. So it's this was his operation. By 1860, I think, let's go to the next one, see if this tells. Yeah, by 1860, he had 120, that's by the census, 120 enslaved men, women, and children raising cotton at Serenola. They also raised some considerable amounts of corn and some of the sugar that we still boil the sugar in Alachua County and make syrup, but it was mainly a cotton plantation. And in 1860, when cotton, mostly short fiber cotton, was the primary export of the United States, both in amount and in value, Alachua County was raising about 1.5 million pounds of long fiber cotton. And they were doing it amazingly, because in 1860, only, according to the census, only 37,000 acres in the county were actually improved. That is, that they were used for any kind of farming or had buildings on them or anything else. Everything else was still pretty much a wilderness and not a lot of valuable farmland. Next. All right, now, in 1860, when all of these South Carolina planters were developing Alachua County, Garth Wilkinson, called Wilkie James, was a teenage boy at school in Massachusetts. He was a son of William James Sr., who had inherited a great deal of money from land speculation by his family in New York State, and really didn't have to do anything beyond educate his children. And one of his sons is William James, that we know, and the other Henry James, that we know. And Garth came along next. And then, well, let's wait well, it's all right. So when the war began in 1861, David Williams volunteered for the Confederate Army. He worked in the Topographic Bureau, making maps. That's not him, I don't believe. That's just a Confederate officer. And 16-year-old Wilkie James joined a Massachusetts regiment as a private. Next. In the summer of 1862, Congress authorized the president to issue an Emancipation Proclamation and called on the states to recruit African-American regiments for the Union Army. The Union Army had taken very heavy casualties, especially in the battles around Richmond in the spring and summer of 1862. And it seemed like we would need to have all hands on deck. Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts responded. Next. So the first of these regiments was created by Governor Andrew as the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. And in early 1863, they began recruiting. And they recruited all over the country and had really a cream of volunteers, of young African-American men, college graduates, lawyers, ministers, school teachers, all sorts of people all around the country, including two sons of Frederick Douglass, all volunteered for the 54th to show what African Americans could do to fight for their own freedom. And Robert Gould Shaw, a Harvard graduate of the class of 1860, was appointed by the governor, and the regiment was ready to go to South Carolina. Young Wilkie James asked to be transferred to the 54th as a private, and he was promptly appointed a sergeant. And when they got to South Carolina, he was promoted to a lieutenant, and by the summer, by July, he was the captain and adjutant. Now, let's look at the next. He was 18 years old, captain and regimental adjutant, and prepared to fight for the freedom of African Americans alongside the brave men who had volunteered for the regiment. Next. The 54th saw their first real action in the attack on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. This was a terribly, badly planned military maneuver. A brigade and ultimately a division of Union forces was to attack a fort out in the harbor that was linked to the land by a narrow strip of sand. And the charts that they were using at headquarters failed to recognize that there had been a hurricane that damaged almost all of that strip, so that the men had to advance, the 54th, the first to go, had to advance shoulder to shoulder, making almost perfect targets. Now, in this picture, which is a Currier and Ives print, obviously not a photograph, but it was based on very carefully on testimony. And here, Colonel Shaw is killed at the moment that he and his men began to swarm over the parapet into the fort. The flag, which was carried by a Haitian immigrant, Wilkie James, in a little memoir, reminded us of that. This was a gentleman from Haiti who had lived a long time in the United States, but who volunteered. So an immigrant carried the flag, and he was killed almost instantly. And the flag was caught by Sergeant Carney of the 54th and carried back. Now, this figure is actually Wilkie James. He was leading the next line, waving his sword, as very much as in this picture. And he was hit. He kept going, even though he had been hit by shrapnel in his side and his upper leg and bleeding very badly. But it was when he got closer that he was taken by a mini ball in his foot, which was a brutal kind of weapon fired from cannons at close range. And he simply collapsed on the sand. Some of his comrades pulled him back from the heap of dead and dying men at the where they had initially attacked, and he was lying on the sand until someone came along, and he had no memory of this, and carried him back 3 miles to a dressing station. And he probably would have died lying out there and with his wounds, except that several days after the battle, the father of a young man who had been killed in that first attack came looking for his son's body. His name was Captain Russell, and Captain Russell had been buried like Shaw and the other privates in just where they fell in a big common grave. But as he was going around looking to see if any of these wounded men might be his son, he recognized Wilkie James, and he took him back to Boston to recover and get proper medical treatment next. Because of his wounds, Wilkie was mustered out in January 1864, but he immediately re-enlisted and served with the 54th. They weren't always in Florida, but they were based at that point in Jacksonville, and he stayed with his regiment to the end of the war. He was finally mustered out in August 1865. And in the course of the campaign in Florida, James was given just a desk job. He couldn't walk. He was obviously of no great value to an attacking column. So he was just counting the beans and that sort of thing. But in their Florida campaign, again, badly planned and badly organized, they ended up with the Battle of Aleutian, where the 54th rescued really the rest of the American column. They were the rear guard that protected them. And at Aleutian, which isn't all that far from where we are, we have letters sent home from soldiers with a Georgia militia regiment that they had shot, killed all the wounded Black prisoners and many of the Black prisoners who were not wounded. And so that was a kind of atrocity that happened here in Florida, where men who had been captured were simply murdered. And the returns showed this, that the prisoners taken were almost all white, even though the bulk of the battle had been fought by Black regiments. Next. Now, after the war, Governor Andrew and John Murray Forbes created the American Land Company and the New England Emigrant Aid Association to encourage Northerners to move south and become planters. We've already met Governor Andrew, and John Murray Forbes was a financier who began in the China trade, that is, supplying opium to China, and then got out of drug dealing and became a railroad builder. He owned the Michigan Central and several other Midwest railroads. He was a very committed abolitionist, and both Andrew and John Murray Forbes had been involved with the Emigrant Aid Association that encouraged Northerners, especially New Englanders, to move to Kansas and to prevent it becoming a slave state before the Civil War. So they had this kind of vision now, and they included Florida in it. So let's go to the next one. Early in 1866, that's John Murray Forbes. Early in 1866, Henry Bruce Scott, who had been a captain in the 2nd Massachusetts, and Garth Wilkinson James from the 54th, purchased over 3,000 acres west of Brooker with money loaned by John Murray Forbes. Scott he was a Harvard graduate of 1860 like Shaw, but he had gone on to get a law degree and actually practiced law for a bit before he joined the Union Army. And James, each had their own plantations. Scott had purchased the Philip Dell plantation, and which was about 2,000 acres. And Garth James purchased one from the Bryan family for $18,000, buying a little under 1,800 acres. So what he got, according to the deed, was everything on the plantation, including the standing crop of cotton and all of the animals, all of the farming implements, and so on. And they began raising cotton and hoping to make a killing and repay John Murray Forbes and their other backers. Next. The difficulty here was that Forbes and Scott aimed at profitable cotton plantations worked by free laborers. Wilkie James, as he tells us in his letters, had a different dream. He created a school that was open to both blacks and whites, which was extraordinary at the time. He encouraged freedmen to claim the rights of citizenship and to vote. And he tells us in one letter how one of the men working on his property had gone to Gainesville to register to vote, and they killed him. And it's as blunt as that. And he hoped to eventually sell off his land to the freedmen, who would then become independent farmers. So he had a dream, and his backers were not on the same mind. So there was some friction between them. Let's go to the next one. Now, back to Ceranola. In 1867, both Scott and Wilkie James bought their properties in January 1866. So this is a year after they had come to Alachua County. David Williams sold Ceranola to George A. Quinby. George A. Quinby in the deed is a businessman resident in New York City, but he came to Alachua County and lived here for about a year. And during that time, interestingly, he was one of the original vestry that formally organized Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in Gainesville and bought land for the church, for a church to be built there. But a year later, he was ready to leave Gainesville and sold the property to Wilkie James, who then became the master of Ceranola. Next. In 1870, according to the census, Wilkie James was listed as a planter. He had a overseer or a farm manager named James McIlvaine, who came from Kentucky. And he and another young man, Charles Robson, who was a partner, the Robson family had an interest in Ceranola with Wilkie James, and they were raising cotton. But at the very end of 1870, Wilkie James sold his interest to his business partner, William R. Robson, the same year. So his stay at Ceranola lasted just under 2 years. And in each case, they had been the victims of a number of things. That the price of long fiber cotton in 1866 had skyrocketed. You couldn't possibly not make a huge profit. By 1867, due in part to weather conditions, in part to market conditions, not only was Alachua County cotton poorly harvested, but the price dropped to almost nothing. So Wilkie was in debt for his first plantation, but he paid off every cent to John Murray Forbes. When he bought Ceranola, he did it with money advanced by his father and in partnership with the Robeson family. William Robeson was a Boston lawyer, and they together managed to lose money at Ceranola because somehow everything seemed to go wrong through the last years of the 60s and the beginning years of the 70s. So let's see the next one, if there is a next one. Yes. All right, well, Wilkie James moved to Milwaukee then, and in 1873 he married Carolyn Carey, whose father and her family were from Milwaukee. And they had a very happy marriage, no children, however. And in 1878, he sold the last of his Alachua County real estate, and his connection with our part of the world was completely ended. He died in 1884. He had never really recovered from his wounds at Fort Wagner and had always been somewhat crippled for his life. He had been unable to fully repay his father, and William James rather cruelly cut him out of his will because he had been a failure. And his brothers, his famous brothers, and his sister Alice decided that they would make sure that he got part of their shares. So the family held together. And this isn't the end of the story. I've forgotten the exact year now. It doesn't matter. But several years ago, a resident of Gainesville named Bertha Williams Lee recorded with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program the story of Ceranola from the point of view of her family. In 1860, we don't have any identification of who the slaves, the enslaved people, are just numbers. They're given an age, but they have no names. In the 1870 census, when Ceranola belonged to Garth Williams, the Garth James, the Ceranola plantation people living there are given their full names. And one of them, with his family, was Mac Williams, who was Bertha Lee's ancestor. And all of these individuals have names. And the interesting thing is that except for the young children, everyone in the African American group, everyone was born in South Carolina. So these were all people who had come south with David Williams when he created the Ceranola plantation. And in the time that Wilkie James and the Robesons owned the property, they actually began the process of selling off some of the land to people who had been formerly enslaved on the property. And one of the individuals who bought land was Mac Williams, Mrs. Lee's ancestor, and they held that property. Many of these the deeds for these properties, they seem to be quite small, as though you were just really getting a patch to grow some groceries on, vegetables on, but some of them were larger. And by 1890, African Americans owned more than 400 of the 1,000 acres of Ceranola plantation. And on, I think it's Southwest 17th is the road that goes through the old plantation. And there in 1865, Mac Williams and several other individuals had organized a Baptist church and built a Baptist church and school on the property. And it continued for a great many years, but the concentration of population moved over toward a place called Minnie Hill. And there they had a second Baptist church, and that was the Minnie Hill Baptist Church. And all of the people here were the formerly enslaved people at Ceranola. And that church succeeded even today as the direct descendant of the Minnie Hill Baptist Church as the missionary Baptist Church on at Ceranola on the Southwest 17th place. And many of these people who had come with David Williams have been the ancestors of prominent people here in Alachua County and contributed to really fulfilling the dream that Wilkie James had of this transition from slavery to freedom to full citizenship and to a full and equal place in the community. And Wilkie James would probably have been very happy with that outcome. So with that, I will stop. And over to you, Pam.
Do we have any questions?
Hi, thank you very much. That was quite interesting. How was the cottons processed and sold? Did it go out through Jacksonville or go up on a train, or how did it get to a port where it could go somewhere that it would be processed or used?
At that point, Payne's Prairie was fully flooded, and it was possible to take it down. Ceranola, for example, backed up on Payne's Prairie. So considering it was a big lake at that point, it was possible to just load cotton on a boat and move it through the various waterways to get to market. And by 1866, the railroad had come to Gainesville, and earlier the old Florida Railroad had opened up the part of the northern Alachua County, so they could put it on trains. They could, and obviously it had to go ultimately to a place like Jacksonville to be shipped out of the state and to the north or overseas.
Okay, thank you. Another question here, Richard?
Thank you. Do we know where the site of the original plantation home was, or in the day?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
The original site of the plantation home itself?
No, I do not. There was it's rather confusing that there was a house built in, gosh, around 1940 with plantation style on part of the old Serenola plantation and called Serenola Plantation, but it had nothing to do with where David Williams and his family or Rookie James and his partners had lived. And I really don't know. It would seem to be one of those things that might be profitably located and excavated, but I bow to more experienced local historians who would know all about that.
Would you explain the connection between Serenola and Hill Plantation? Is there a connection?
And which plantation?
Serenola and Hill.
Oh, and Hale. Well, they're at some distance apart, but it was that they were all related. They were and mainly through the Chestnut family. David Williams, who created Serenola, was married to a Chestnut, and the Hales, Karen Kirkman can tell you all about this, but the Hales were also Chestnut siblings or relatives or whatever. So they were all cousinage at least. And clearly, because they were all coming from a very small area, they clearly all knew each other personally before they ever came to South Carolina. And one would encourage another to do this. And I would guess, I'm not, this is just pure speculation. I would guess that the folks who were pioneering in Florida in the 1850s with coming from South Carolina were people who did not inherit the family plantation. So David Williams was born at a plantation called Society Hill, but he apparently did not inherit it. So he struck out to pioneer in Florida instead. He did actually go back to Darlington County, South Carolina, and he died in Camden in 1904. So he outlived everybody else, and he was an older man.
A little comment. There was a movie made about the Massachusetts 54th called Glory.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that either.
Oh, there was a movie made about the Massachusetts 54th called Glory.
Oh yes, Glory. Yes, yes, very much. Had several books written about it. Many years ago, I, using his letters that were in the New York Public Library, I wrote a biography of Robert Gould Shaw. But by the time I had it all typed up and ready to submit to a publisher, the publisher had no interest in it because it all just been a couple of other books, and the Robert Gould Shaw market was flooded. So, but I've always had a very deep regard for the 54th and its sister regiment, the 55th. The 55th took, because of so many people volunteered for the 54th, they were able to make up the second regiment at the same time. And one of the individuals, and here my 89-year-old memory is going to fail. I can't think of his name, but one of the individuals who fought with the 55th, and who again was very badly wounded, was a gentleman who came to Gainesville. He went immediately after the war, he went north and got a college degree, or completed a college degree, and qualified as a lawyer. So he came to Gainesville as a lawyer and he published a newspaper and was elected to the state legislature during Reconstruction, when African Americans could vote and hold office. And he moved later to Jacksonville and lived there for a long time, but was very active into the 20th century. He died a very old man, obviously. He died in the 1920s, and he is buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Gainesville with his wife and family, because he had this connection with Gainesville over the years. And Josiah T. Walls is much better known because he had much higher office. But I just can't think of his name immediately. So, but you know,
Richard was
there were wonderful people in those regiments.
Richard was the 1940s house that you're talking about, the one on Williston Road, on the west side of Williston Road, that was moved south about 12 years ago.
Yeah, I think that was it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Another question here, Richard? Yes, thank you for your very informative information. There is a house down at the end of that 17th Street, and a doctor's store, a very well-known surgeon, dermatologist, who has collected much skin from people living in Okamic. It's a very interesting looking house, and if you Google that house, it shows pictures from the inside, and apparently they have a lot of uh, big game heads and so on and so forth inside, and there's always a roaring fireplace going. I myself have not been to Doctor Store, thank goodness, but professionally, but it looks like a very interesting place. And the last time I was there, probably 5 or 6 years ago, down that street, there was a for sale sign on the property, but that's all I can tell you. I'd love to go in the house, not as a patient.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh.
That's not an old house. Dr. Storer built that. And he told me not too long ago about a vision he had. He had somehow seen that from the air in his imagination. And he was driving north into Gainesville to the office he had in a building he hated. And he saw a for sale sign there and stopped and walked through the weeds and bought that and built the house that he had seen in his vision. So that's what's there now.
Is that the voice of Roy Hunt?
It was, yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, we thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. All right, I'm trying to leave.